June 6th, 1944. A day to remember, a day that made the world different. It was the D-Day, and it was on this day that the biggest invasion was conducted on the beaches of Normandy. Rather than looking at the Allied forces, we will consider the day through the spectacles of the German officers in their bunkhouses. How did they feel and think about the invasion as it took place in the beaches of Normandy? Today, we can consider this standpoint. It was cold, gray, and mist as it covered the world beyond the German bunkers on that early June morning, with the first light peeking in over the English Channel. The heavy concrete walls inside dampened all sounds, and the silence there was heavier than normal. The officers themselves were on the alert, and every minute they looked at their instruments and peered through the small holes in order to scan the horizon, which seemed empty. There was a feeling of fear in the air. One knew that any minute the Allies would strike, but when or how was still a secret. All soldiers attempted to stay calm, but the strain was evident in the few muttered words and the fidgeting. Then, when the sun had started to appear, the actual view of the invasion became visible. On the unlimited expanse of water, it seemed as though the sea itself had risen and moved. Thousands of ships had sprung over the line, with their dark lines becoming more distinct every minute. Essentially, about 7,000 ships were crowded together, all of which were men and machine-laden in anticipation of war. Hundreds of planes were flying above the channel, the rattle of their engines sounding like far-off thunder, anxious to join in the attack. The enormity of the object which the Germans were now looking at had never been observed by mankind. Even the most senior officers who had been through the war and were veterans that had been hardened by war could not grasp the mass coming against them. Yet, somewhere in the bunkhouses, they tried their best to rest and prepare, because they realized that their determination and their fortifications would be put to the test very soon. The Germans had been tirelessly constructing what was known as the Atlantic Wall, a concrete fortification that was running along the western coast of Europe since 1942, starting with Norway and continuing down to Spain. This massive chain of defense was supposed to prevent any invading forces to land on the beaches and proceed inland. Field Marshal Rommel was a respected and highly experienced German commander who was assigned the role of defending the part of the coast in France. He tried to bring about all efforts to fortify the fortifications when he realized the danger of an invasion and sowed as many mines as possible on the beaches to create numerous obstacles between the bunkers which were meant to delay or stop the attacking troops. He even had low-lying grounds flooded and sharp poles put in the ground to prevent landing of paratroopers and gliders. All this came to naught, however, because the wall needed to cover almost 750 miles of coastline, and it was impossible to defend every inch of the wall perfectly. Building of these fortifications demanded extremely large amounts of labor, and the large number of workers involved in this construction were often slaves, captives of war, refugees, and even German soldiers forcibly used in the construction tasks. The German officers were under pressure in the bunkers, and they were ready to attack, but hoped that their defense and weapons would withstand. In the meantime, the Allies were strategizing their invasion way back in Britain. Those who had been largely based in Britain, thousands of troops had been put through rigorous training. Scientists and engineers were coming in, developing and testing new weapons and equipment, which specifically targeted this operation. All the details were checked and practiced, even the landing of the amphibious, or the drops made by the air sources, because every detail was always tested so that the possibility of success was as maximum as possible. The attempt to deceive the German troops on the time and location of the invasion was also very significant. The Allies used an ornate deception scheme, which involved setting up of fake airfields and the deployment of inflatable planes and vehicles that would make the Germans believe that the main assault would be made at Calais, the nearest place to Britain, and not the actual target, Normandy. This misinformation led to confusion in the German command, to an extent that they thinly spread their defenses as opposed to what would have been the case. The tension was gradually mounting in the German bunkers of the French shore. Even though the German intelligence was keeping an eye on Allied movements due to the spies and scouts, the secrecy surrounding the D-Day planning posed a challenge to the intelligence in ascertaining the precise specifications. As the days passed and the time to the 6th of June approached, there were more and more discussions among the German officers on the point of the landings being made and how to act. Higher command orders tended to interfere or contradict each other, contributing to the confusion and anxiety experienced by people charged with the responsibility of coastal defense. The great confusion of false intelligence planted suspicion and strained nerves so that many commanders found themselves in no small apprehension, awaiting the impending attack. Orders kept on changing, and some officers were arguing on how best to respond. There was an increase in tension day by day until June 6th. Back in early 1944, Field Marshal Rommel played a major role by reinforcing the defensive positions of the Atlantic Wall, and he knew well that the triumph of the German defense would lie in preventing the Allies upon their arrival at the beaches. He was of the opinion that any postponement in a counterattack at the shoreline would be fatal, and therefore insisted that the beaches be highly mine and concrete bunks, anti-tanks obstacles, and underwater mines to be placed in such a way that the landing boats would be destroyed before they can discharge their cargo. But Rommel was quite aware of the tremendous challenges they had. The coastline was several hundred miles long, and it could not be effectively defended inch by inch. Nevertheless, even with a great amount of labor and resources invested in the fortifications, there were still big areas and weak points that posed enormous problems in creating a sound defense. Rommel was greatly felt by the troops and officers in the bunkers. His image of a hard but motivating leader provided the tense environment with a somber decoration. Men turned to him to guide them and wished to have good leadership in the coming hours till the anticipated invasion. His authoritative stare and urgency drove soldiers to be ready to fight the toughest battle in their lives. Officers were waiting in the concrete walls, and they knew that the next few hours would be the test of their courage and determination as never before. The strategic motivation of Rommel and the harsh reality of the situation in which he and his men had to defend an enormous and defenseless coastline made the atmosphere tense, with each hour of life being worth a great deal, and the destiny of many people resting on the choice of action taken in those bunkhouses. When the 6th of June broke daylight, there were thunderous volleys of explosions along the shores of Normandy, indicating the opening of an unknown attack. The German bunkers were crawling with the officers and soldiers whose minds were tangled with fear and determination. It was no longer quiet outside. The air was filled with the roar of bounding airplanes, the thunderclap of naval guns, and the crackle of fire. Although they were attacked constantly, much of the German line, great fortifications, gun pit, and breastworks, still remained intact after the first onslaught. Their stand was short-lived, but they remained holding on to hope that their well-planned Atlantic Wall would stand the storm of Allied invasion. But even under the concrete and steel, the soldiers in the bunkhouses could sense the shocks of the rattling anarchy, the impending conflict that would stretch them to the very limits of their determination. The amphibious vessels were moving towards the assigned beaches with the thousands of soldiers to storm the land, and the defenders could only watch as the early morning chaos occurred, with the boats heading their way. The German officers shouted at their men and encouraged them to be tough and fight hard. The panic began to spread in the ranks in the bunkers as they witnessed the largest invasion ever witnessed. Several soldiers who bravely fought despite the fear in their faces, but whose hearts were loath to fail, defended behind the solid walls and loaded guns at the onrush of the waves and attempted to stamp the holes where the enemy appeared all too likely to push through. It was desperation and determination in the air, and every soldier had the awareness that it was this day or nothing, and that the future of an entire Europe was going to be determined. In the meantime, The German command was in disarray as the extent of the invasion was uncovered. The synchronized waves of the landing crafts, the continuous air attack, and the sheer mass of the Allied forces resulted in a constant push. Officers in the bunker would listen to the thunderous explosions and gunfire far away, and each explosion and gunfire indicated that some other section of the coast had fallen into the hands of the enemy. Overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of the attackers, the gallant stand of the defenders, however, could not be defeated without a fierce battle. There were numerous bunkers that still were operational, and dogs tenaciously repelled the advancing Allies by firing heavy casualties at them. The battle within those concrete bastions was no gentler than in the beaches, and men were bottled up in them, shooting through windows of the slits and endeavoring to resist when the overwhelming wave of invasion continued to roll on. It was a rough, tension-filled, and lethal scene, the Germans on the losing end of a battle that could not be stopped. The fight within the German bunkers was horrible. As each shell burst all around her, the concrete walls were shaking like leaves, and dust and smoke flew out of the narrow, dark corridors. The atmosphere was stiff and difficult to breathe. The German troops struggled to their best and fired their guns where they could, but there were numerous bunkers, few of which were so close that they could be easily covered by fire. To make their situation worse, Allied paratroopers had been put down on their own side behind their lines, so they could not escape, and so could not be reinforced. This huge, well-coordinated attack was in addition to the fact that the defenders were outnumbered and encircled. Desperate messages popped out of the radio channels as the battle advanced. Reinforcements had been ordered, but were tardy in arriving or were beaten up by the approaching enemy. German officers attempted to lift the morale of their soldiers in the bunkers, encouraging them to defend their positions even though the odds they had were almost insurmountable. The combat was hard and incessant and continued throughout the day. Under the intensive bombing and attack, many of the bunkers were so damaged or destroyed altogether. Others had to give up as long as they were not able to withstand, but even there the desire to fight was so great until the end. Intense noise of gunfire, explosions, and shouting overwhelmed the bunkers and gave the impression that the world was coming to a close. Based on the disorder, soldiers would barely make it through and would at times have to battle in near darkness with smoke covering the atmosphere. The walls which had been erected to defend them were the battlegrounds themselves. This was a display of bravery and desperation of the people inside as they struggled with the large number of the enemy against few resources and low morale. The defenders were aware that the struggle was going down the drain as they tried to fight back. However, the ugliness of war was that nobody would surrender in the bunkhouses so quickly. The battle went on until nightfall, signaling the conclusion of one of the most fateful and bloody days of the World War II. It was a day of fear, courage, and chaos in the bunkers, a profane experience of the harsh reality of the German soldiers when history is being made around them. By the evening of June 6, 1944, the German troops were disastrously beaten and thousands of their men killed, wounded, or captured in the fierce combat on the beaches of Normandy and along the surrounding precincts. The surviving officers stood quiet with somber anticipation of the unyielding onslaught of the Allies that pressed inland. The Atlantic Wall, which had been so dominant and symbolized the defense of this coast, was in ruins, but concrete walls could not resist the sheer mass and violence of the invasion. The German soldiers were exhausted physically and psychologically in the bunkers. Fatigue and disappointment were pervading the atmosphere as they were dealing with the terrible reality of their ruined defense. There was something uncertain in their minds. How had the Allies succeeded in breaking a fortress that seemed to be nearly impregnable? Why had so much gone wrong in a struggle that was destined to fix their possession of France? The Normandy Invasion was not just a ruthless battle, it was a commencement of a turning point in the war. The German hold over Western Europe was fading off, and the tide was clearly turning away to the Allies. German officers were contemplating the glory they saw exhibited on each side as the Allied troops settled in and extended their ground, and the devoted stand of the German troops who were fighting against enormous odds. Both parties were participants in an epic battle that had them entangled in a war bigger and more intricate even than either was able to envision. This is a day which is marked in history, and it marked the beginning of the sequence of events that would ultimately see the emancipation of France and the eventual conquest of Nazi Germany. The direction of the war was changed, and so was the destiny of the million. Amid the chaos, there were flickers of remarkable courage inside those bunkers, officers risking their lives to rally defenses, medics treating the wounded under relentless fire, and soldiers standing their ground even as hope faded. They were ordinary men swept into extraordinary circumstances, afraid yet steadfast, uncertain yet unyielding. Their stories remind us that behind every battle lie human faces, fragile hearts, and silent acts of strength. That was life inside the German bunkers on June 6, 1944, a day defined by fear, courage, confusion, but most importantly, sacrifice, seen through the eyes of the defenders themselves. It reminds us that history is never just one story. It's many lives intertwined in the moments of fate. Thank you for joining this journey back in time. If you found this perspective meaningful, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, keep exploring the untold sides of history.